Sego, bonjour, hello. I've just greeted you in the three languages of the cultural groups which are most responsible for the Kingston that we live in and that we know today in order of their appearance in this area. The first language is Mohawk and represents one of the many First Nations communities who came to, for hundreds of years, who came here first to trade and eventually to settle. The other two languages represent, of course, the arrival of French and English-speaking Europeans. As a sign of respect for the First Nations communities, I will now read the City of Kingston's Land Acknowledgement Statement, first in Mohawk, followed by French, and then in English. G. Canadian de Kingston, ready to Rondares, G. Rahunanjage, Ne Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Danon Huron-Wendat, Danon Deutsche-Gunaron, Gi Redinagarasala, G Redinigunare, Ne Satatawatsa, Ahunja. La ville de Kingston reconnaît que nous sommes sur la patrie traditionnelle des nations des Anishinaabe, des Haudenosaunee et des Huron-Wendat, et nous remercions ces nations pour leur intendance sur cette terre partagée. The City of Kingston acknowledges that we are on the traditional homeland of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat, and we thank these nations for their care and stewardship over this shared land. To members of the Kingston Historical Society and their guests, and to those who may be here for the first time, welcome to today's ceremony of remembrance. Je m'appelle Don Richardson. C'est mon plaisir d'être votre maître des cérémonies cet après-midi. My name is Don Richardson, Secretary of the Kingston Historical Society, and it is my very real pleasure to be your Master of Ceremonies for today's program. Au nom de la Société historique de Kingston, je souhaite à toutes et à tous un accueil chaleureux à notre cérémonie commémorative pour notre très Premier Ministre, Sir John A Macdonald. On behalf of the Kingston Historical Society, I extend to you all a very warm welcome to our ceremony of remembrance, which acknowledges the passing of our very first Prime Minister, Sir John A Macdonald. Today we acknowledge Sir John A's legacy. With his vision, through determination, persistence, and dare I say Scottish single-mindedness, he managed to pull 4 provinces together to form the Dominion of Canada. Not content to stop there, he then pushed ahead to make a country from sea to sea, a country founded on peace, order, and good government. As Northrop Frye called it, the peaceable kingdom. But why do we, the Kingston Historical Society, and you, gather annually, sometimes in blaring heat, or as today in weather that could have been very inclement, for which Paul Van Nest encouraged us to bring our rain gear, and Eva Barnes kindly offered to bring paper towels so our butts wouldn't get wet? Or once we were in the little church up the hill where there's no washroom, but we gathered. Believe me, no washroom for a 78-year-old man is a daunting thing to look forward to. And today we have the added bonus of mosquitoes. Why do we do this? As Duncan said, we do it for John A, because he deserves it. So this event here on this day acknowledges the many aspects of the legacy of Sir John A Macdonald and permits members of the Kingston community to pay their respects on the anniversary of his passing. Maintenant, un peu d'histoire. For those who may be here for the first time, some historical context for today's ceremony. As outlined in your pamphlet, today the Kingston Historical Society continues a tradition begun 135 years ago. 1 year after Macdonald's death in 1891, the first memorial tribute to him took place here at Cataraqui Cemetery in 1892. It was organized by the Macdonald Club of Canada and later by the Conservative Party. The Kingston Historical Society took over the graveside ceremony in 1970, and we continue to carry on this fine tradition, a tradition which saw only one cancellation, and that was in 2020 because of the restrictions related to the COVID epidemic. At this point, I would usually invite Craig Bowles, the manager of Cataraqui Cemetery, to bring words of welcome. Unfortunately, because of another commitment, Craig cannot be here today. He's asked, however, to extend a warm welcome on behalf of the cemetery. He stated that the cemetery is always pleased to participate and invited us to come back and walk through it. I can attest to the fact that the cemetery is a very beautiful and most serene place to have a walk. I now welcome the Venerable William Clark for a religious reading.
Merci, thank you. The reading I've chosen for today is taken from the letter to the Hebrews attributed to St. Paul. In it you will recognize a brief little phrase, particularly if you are a member of the Order of Canada, for it is its motto. But I think it also expresses Sir John A Macdonald's desire and the desire of every Canadian citizen that has followed in his footsteps. Having written of his heroes, the author writes, "All these people died still believing what God had promised them. They did not receive what was promised, but they saw it all from a distance and welcomed it. They agreed they were foreigners and nomads here on earth. Obviously, people who say such things are looking forward to a country they can call their own. If they had longed for the country they came from, they could have gone back. But what they were looking for was a better country, a heavenly home. That is why God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Thanks be to God."
It is now my pleasure to call upon Peter Gower, President of the Kingston Historical Society, to the podium.
Well, thank you very much, Don. Distinguished guest, members and visitors, I hate starting with apologies, but firstly, again, I would apologise for the absence of Craig Bowles, the manager of Cataraqui Cemetery. A family death prevents him from being with us today. And usually we're able to thank him, and I will, in his absence, to thank him and his staff for preparing this site to perfection, and we thank them for their continued efforts in that area. Secondly, I would ask you to keep in mind the spirit of Alan McLaughlin, who organised this gathering for 16 years. It was fate that the first speaker he brought was Roy McSkimming, and Roy would be the last speaker he heard when he attended here last year, a few months before his death. And thirdly, because of illness, Anne Stevens is unable to attend, and the society wreath will be laid by Leanna Shaw. But we gather today to remember and commemorate one of the many whose lifetime achievements and failures have been interpreted, reinterpreted, misinterpreted, and recycled for whatever ends the interpreter had in mind. Last year, some may remember, I quoted William Shakespeare. Recently, I was reminded that Mark Twain wrote, "To arrive at a just estimate of a renowned man's character, one must judge it by the standards of his time, not ours." And we all know that Sir John has been multi-interpreted by trained historians, political foes, biased Canadians, devoted researchers, and the travellers who may wonder, on leaving Highway 401 at exit 615, who the person was for whom the boulevard was named. But they may remember that once the whole highway carried his name. So this gathering, as Don mentioned, is one of an ongoing series. It's about the 60th, at which we remember and think about what Sir John believed in, what he achieved, and what he failed at. We try to understand those with different viewpoints, and I know that today you will gain new insights into Sir John and subtly change your opinion of him based on what you hear. So thank you for taking time out of your weekend for being with us and to communally remember our town councillor, our Member of Parliament, and Canada's Prime Minister, one whom without Canada would be a different country today, and probably not for the better. Thank you.
J'invite maintenant le Dr. Duncan McDowell pour nous présenter notre conférencier cet après-midi.
Thank you, Don, and good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Greg Piasetzki. In May of 1891, Sir John Macdonald, just 2 months after winning his 6th majority election, was struck by a succession of 3 strokes, which progressively deprived him of lucid speech and sensation on the right side of his body. Macdonald's long, faithful doctor, James Grant, spoke plainly. Hemorrhage on the brain, condition hopeless. As anxiety grew across the nation, Sir John's old allies in national development, the railway companies, set up a telegraph tent on the lawn of his home, Earnscliffe, in Ottawa, to expedite news and its relay across the nation. And on the morning of June 6, 1891, shortly after 10:20 a.m., Macdonald's private secretary, Joseph Pope, emerged from the house to announce bluntly, "Gentlemen, Sir John Macdonald is dead." The telegraph immediately came alive, tapping out the sad news coast to coast. Within an hour, church bells rang across the nation. Indeed, as a historian, I would argue that Macdonald's death marked the first time in our history when the whole nation was immediately apprised of an incident that affected our future. After a state funeral in Ottawa, a black train conveyed Macdonald's body to his native Kingston, where it was greeted by a huge crowd outside of City Hall on June 10th. Remember, the train station was downtown then, not here. A somber civil cortege then bore the coffin to where we stand today in Cataraqui Cemetery. Here, with military and religious ceremony, he was solemnly laid to rest. Thus began, as we have heard just a moment ago, a tradition of revering Macdonald's role as a Kingstonian who rose to the challenge of building scattered colonies into a nation. 4 years later, in June of 1895, Kingstonians gathered in City Park to witness the dedication of a statue honoring Sir John's achievement, a statue funded by public subscription. We today have gathered to perpetuate that tradition, one precious to both our immediate community and to the nation at large. Over the years, speakers as varied as former prime ministers and academics on this June day have echoed the original outpouring of respect in 1891, modifying it to Canada's ever-changing sensibilities, while all the time continuing to honor Macdonald's making of the nation. Today, we are delighted to pass that torch to Greg Piasetzki, who joins us as a man who shares in our pride of Macdonald. As I hope our program amply demonstrates, Greg is a lawyer with more than 4 decades of experience in intellectual law. Like Sir John, Greg acquired his legal acumen here in Kingston, studying and later lecturing at Queen's Law School. And as Sir John did in the 1870s, he has practiced law in Toronto with the firm of Piasetzki, Nininger, Kvass. His expertise, as I have mentioned, lies in intellectual law, something that is close to our dedication as historians to the protection and clarification of inherited ideas and vested values in our society. Similarly, Greg has specialized in the process of dispute resolution in the litigation of copyrights and trademarks, whether they involve hockey teams or broadcast networks. That same dedication to protecting integrity of ideas and creativity is what brings him to Sir John's graveside today. Born in Manitoba of Polish, Quebecois, Acadian, Métis, and Indigenous ancestors, Greg has shown immense passion for his Canadian citizenship. In recent years, he has engaged in contentions that have sullied the reputation of our first great Prime Minister. In doing so, he has proven to be both an incisive researcher and an eloquent author. Whether in the pages of the National Post or the Canadian Encyclopedia, Greg has constructively enriched our balanced understanding of Sir John and his times. I therefore welcome Greg to this cherished ground.
Thank you for the kind introduction. I love it when they call intellectual property intellectual law. It's the intellectual part of it is it's more nuts and bolts than intellectual a lot of the time. It's a real pleasure to be here and have an opportunity to speak about Sir John A. I got involved with Sir John A. Around 2018 when my law school, for which I was an active fundraiser for the class endowment, was considering removing Macdonald's name from the law school. And I thought, you know what, I'm a lawyer, I'll look into this a bit. So I looked into it a bit, and what I told them then is going to be more or less what I tell you now. It was a story that was completely different from the story that was just opening up at that time, and later took full flood in the national press. But it was not a fair story or an accurate story, factually correct story in terms of the actual circumstances and the actual actions of Sir John A. So I'm going to give you some of what I've been talking about for the last 8 years. I would also just mention, though, in terms of where we are today, I took a look at a couple reports of the original funeral for Sir John A. And I was very impressed at the fact that citizens of Kingston marched in a line 8 deep that ran more than 3 kilometers long from downtown Kingston to this site for his burial. There were 2 brass bands accompanying the procession and playing the Dead March, a piece played in slow tempo, featuring heavy, measured beat, mimicking and reinforcing the solemn cadence of the funeral procession. The city itself was in mourning that day, and local accounts report that in a city of 20,000 people, there was not one drunk man and not one loud word, which tells you something about life in the city in those days. Macdonald, and sorry, some of this may be a little redundant. Some people gave a bit of historical background, but I don't have much of it. Macdonald had represented Kingston in the legislature of the province of Canada and in the federal parliament for an incredible combined total of more than 38 years, 19 of them as Prime Minister. 2 days after his death, a number of speeches were made in the House of Commons, acknowledging the country's loss. But it is only Sir Wilfrid Laurier's speech that is remembered today. Laurier and Macdonald were fierce political adversaries and opponents. But Laurier spoke to and for a nation, paying full tribute to Macdonald and his achievements, and acknowledging that in the supreme art of governing men, Sir John A. Macdonald was gifted as few men in any land or any age were gifted, qualities which would have made him famous wherever these qualities were exercised. And this was no exaggeration. Macdonald's accomplishments are legion, and for most of our history, he was rightly honoured as Canada's first Prime Minister and the most important of the Fathers of Confederation. He'd served 3 terms as a Premier of the United Province of Canada pre-Confederation and 2 terms as a Prime Minister of Canada. He's widely considered, and I'm sorry, some of you people are probably avid Sir John A. fans, so you'll know this, but just by way of background, he's widely considered to have written a majority of the terms of Confederation and to have played a critical role in seeing the negotiations through to a successful completion. His government negotiated the purchase of Rupert's Land, that is most of northern and western Canada, and constructed the Canadian Pacific Railway, which in turn brought British Columbia into Confederation. In short, he gave us most of the land area that we know today as Canada. His national policy replacing free trade with tariff barriers to protect Canadian industries was just as controversial then as free trade and tariffs are today. The national policy would nurture some Canadian manufacturers, but also would mean higher prices for Canadians than if they bought their goods direct from the US. But he took the issue to the public twice, in the 1878 election and again in 1891, and he prevailed each time. To summarize the view of his biographer Richard Gwynne, no Macdonald, no Canada. More recently, his reputation has come under attack, largely for his alleged mishandling of Indigenous issues. These issues include the residential schools, related claims of cultural genocide, the handling of famine relief supplies in Western Canada when the buffalo population collapsed, on which the Indigenous population relied. However, a closer view of the historical record, particularly the records of the government section formerly known as the Department of Indian Affairs, shows that such claims do not stand up to even modest scrutiny. The department kept very detailed records of its activities, and it produced annual reports 500 to 1,000 pages long summarizing all its activities on every reserve. Those reports were delivered to every member of Parliament and made available to the public. There was nothing secret going on. A lot of money was being spent. Indian Affairs was often the second or third largest budget item in the Government of Canada's budget. People had a keen interest in it. So these stories were all actively reported. But let's look at the issues that have been raised against them. Looking first at the residential schools. The construction of the Indian Day in residential schools was part of a larger social movement in the 1870s to require that all children of every race have at least 4 years of schooling. Before that, schooling was largely a private matter. If your parents wanted you to have some schooling, they paid someone to give you some schooling. Or maybe some parents gathered together and got a teacher in to teach 5 or 10 kids. It wasn't a public issue. The movement in the 1870s reflected the public's belief that certain basic reading, writing, and arithmetic skills were needed to succeed in a society that was rapidly changing from overwhelmingly rural and agricultural to urban and industrial. And this change happened over about 50 years. It was an enormous transition where most people now lived in cities from when most people lived on the land. The system of Indian Day in residential schools was intended to provide Indigenous children with the same basic skills and opportunities as their European counterparts. The federal government began building the Indian schools in the 1880s, and it eventually operated more than 300 on-reserve day schools and 80 residential schools. The day schools, the children went home to their parents each night. The residential schools, they stayed for 8 months and had 2 months off for the summer holidays, and usually a couple weeks at Easter and Christmas. Just over 50% of students were in day schools and 50% were in the residential schools. Completely ignored today is the fact that Indian parents had to apply in writing on their children's behalf for admission to a residential school. It was the parents who decided if their children went to school and how long they stayed. And the length of their stay for most of the history of the residential schools was 1 year. Well into the 1950s, 60 years after Sir John A. died, 70 years after they began building the schools in volume, 50% or more students still dropped out after grade 1 and few made it to grade 3. At one time this was common knowledge. In the 1940s, a government commission bemoaned the fact that most Indian students, whether in day or residential schools, were only staying for 1 year. The matter was reported in the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star. However, the government continued to leave it to Indigenous parents to make the decision on how long their children stayed in school, whether a day school or a residential school. In the late 1950s, the government began to close the residential schools. They were expensive to run, and modern transportation and the use of billets, that is, homes that were open to kids to stay in private homes or specially built student residences, meant more Indian students could attend day schools. That is, they built special residences just for Indian kids who would then stay in the residence, go to the local public day school usually, although in some cases there were specialized purely Indian schools, but mostly they were public schools. At the same time, Indian parents, with radio and television now bringing the outside world in, could see that it mattered more that their children had an education. And so suddenly from the late 1950s to the early 1960s, the kids began staying longer, on average to grade 5. There were still children not attending school at all, but they were becoming fewer and fewer in number. A system in which most students attend day schools and where most of those in day or residential schools attend for only 1 year can hardly be considered a program of genocide. Interestingly, the Americans also operated a school system with both residential and day schools, where they had, like everything else, they have 10 times as many students in the school system. In 1915, an American official came up to look at the Canadian system to see, what we did better or worse than they did. He praised our system for its success in preserving indigenous approach, he said, which was intended to, quote, obliterate his racial identity. So that's the view of an outsider coming in 1915 after the schools have been running for 20 years and Sir John A.'s been dead for 15 or 20 years. As to the deaths of students at residential schools, children did die in residential schools from disease and accidents. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission identified approximately 3,200 deaths among the 150,000 students who attended. So that's a mortality rate of about 2%. However, at the same time, the mortality rate for school-aged children, non-Indigenous children in the late 1800s and early 1900s was lower, but not by much. It was as high as 2.5% for European kids in the 1880s, dropping to below 1% by 1940. So very similar numbers, slightly higher for Indigenous kids. But keep this in mind, given that the overall Indigenous death rate today on reserves is nearly 2 times higher than that for non-Indigenous Canadians, the 2% mortality rate in the residential schools is unexceptional and to be expected based on natural causes and accidents. So there's no mystery in the deaths at these schools, nothing suspicious or nefarious. The higher mortality rate then and now on Indian reserves is largely the result of there being few employment opportunities on remote reserves, which means you basically have a welfare economy supported by the government. And such an economy more or less continuates a culture of poverty, drug and alcohol abuse and addiction, family breakdown and violence. Alcohol abuse was officially recognized as a disaster for Indigenous Canadians in Canada just under 200 years ago by British Royal Commission sent over to study the issue. What can we do to help Indigenous Canadians succeed? Their answer was ban the sale of alcohol. So the sale of alcohol was banned from 1840 onward until the Supreme Court of Canada, in its wisdom in 1969, decided it was discriminatory to ban it. With the help of the force of law behind it, it was possible for some reserves to remain dry. Without the force of law, it was almost impossible for reserves to remain dry. So alcohol and then drugs became absolute disasters on reserves and remain that until this day. A number of reserves tried to maintain dry reserves, but it wasn't possible. Too many ways to access a remote reserve. There's all kinds of ways to get in. There's no fence around it. Here's another sad fact. Fetal alcohol syndrome, which is caused by a mother drinking alcohol during pregnancy, exists on Indian reserves today at levels 10 to 100 times higher than in the rest of Canadian society. Fetal alcohol syndrome results in children with mild to severe learning and behavioral difficulties, leading in turn to high rates of violence, including spousal and sexual abuse, addiction, and suicide. The results of this abuse are seen across the country in the crime statistics among Indigenous Canadians, in particular the shocking number of Indigenous women murdered and missing at the hands of Indigenous men. I'm sorry this stuff is kind of traumatic, but it's necessary to have some understanding of what's going on. A number of other initiatives of Macdonald's government saved tens of thousands of Indigenous lives and are equally inconsistent with any notion that he had an interest in genocide, cultural or otherwise. Smallpox killed thousands of Indigenous people in Canada in some pre-Confederation years. Accordingly, Macdonald's government initiated a program that ran for more than 20 years to ensure that every Indigenous person in Canada, no matter how remote their location in the north or the west, was vaccinated against smallpox. This was a major initiative, with vaccination teams traveling on foot or horseback and spending months in remote areas. Macdonald's national vaccination program ended smallpox as a threat to Indigenous well-being in Canada. The nationwide program was so successful that in 1885, when a particularly deadly smallpox outbreak killed 3,000 residents of Montreal, the Cataraqui Reserve just across the river from Montreal, just a 30-minute paddle, reported but very few cases of the disease. Everyone on the reserve had already been vaccinated by the federal government. Untold numbers of Indigenous people died throughout the Canadian West prior to the 1870s as a result of smallpox, yet due to the commitment of Macdonald's government and the Canadian people, the death toll among Native Canadians from disease by the 1880s was close to zero. The smallpox vaccination is one of Canada's great public health success stories. It saved many, many lives. Macdonald deserves his share of the glory. Similarly, when the buffalo population collapsed in 1880, Macdonald immediately initiated what was certainly the largest famine relief program in Canadian history. At one point, it was estimated that 10,000 to 20,000 Indigenous Canadians depended on the program for food. It should be noted that this was an enormous undertaking. There was no railway. Let me repeat that. There was no railway. To get goods to Western Canada meant buying them in Eastern US or Eastern Canada, shipping them to the United States, sending them on a partially completed railway partway across the United States, then shipping them north by horse or bull, ox cart. This was like a 6-month journey to move that food from Eastern Canada to the West. The program was, of course, beset by the usual missteps, incompetence, and corruption that occur in every hastily organized government program. However, even one of Macdonald's harshest critics, James Dashuk, in his 2000 book Clearing the Plains, acknowledged that Macdonald's government avoided a, quote, region-wide mortality of the Indigenous population from starvation. It should be noted that the buffalo population collapse itself was a result of overhunting over the previous 100 years or so. This was something in which Indigenous people and European people both participated. The buffalo was in huge demand. The fur was used for fur coats and for carpet. The bones were used for things. The meat was used for, dog food and the like. So the whole animal was in huge demand, and these enormous herds of millions were roaming at one point across the prairies. So everybody participated in this. Indians were just as happy as anyone else to get the cash reward you got for bringing in a buffalo hide. Macdonald's also criticized for providing only half rations to those Indians who were off reserve. Now remember, the number treaties were negotiated in the 1870s. Number treaties just refer to a number given to a treaty for a certain part of Canada along our border with the States and going into the West. So those were negotiated over about an 8 or 10 year period in the 1870s. Everyone, Indigenous or non-Indigenous, knew the buffalo were declining. It had been evident for about 30 years that the herds were getting smaller. So one of the treaty terms, and it was the accepted quid pro quo, was that the government would provide famine relief if you were on your reserve. The whole point of those treaties was to carve out reserves to avoid friction and the Indian wars that had taken place in the United States. And this term was inserted with the specific understanding that the buffalo in particular were collapsing and this famine relief would be needed. And the term of the treaty was, if you were on your reserve as required by treaty, we will provide you with famine relief. So Macdonald is criticized today for only providing half rations if you're off reserve. He had no obligation to provide any rations. The whole point of the treaty and the rations being part of the treaty were to encourage people to comply with the treaty so we avoid the Indian wars in the United States. So the treaty obligations went both ways, and both had an obligation to comply. So his half rations are not the horrible thing you hear. And first of all, half rations are enough to live on. They're just not a comfortable ration. And if you went back to your reserve, you got full rations. So that was the whole point. Finally, as a last major point, a stark difference between the Canadian settlement experience and that of the Americans is the absence of Indian wars. The Americans fought a series of Indian wars over a period of a century and a bit, in which 60,000 Indigenous people and 40,000 settlers and soldiers died. Macdonald was determined to avoid such bloodshed. His government policy was to ensure that there were treaties in place and signed before allowing settlement in Western Canada. And he did that. That's why the treaties were signed over 10 years. In addition, his government created the Northwest Mounted Police, to deter incursions from the United States and to protect the legal rights of both Indigenous people and settlers once settlement began. As the famous Indian chief Crowfoot said in 1877, "The mounted police have protected us as the feathers of the bird protect it from the frosts of winter." There was a very warm relationship in those days. There was a lot of respect on the part of Indigenous people for the RCMP, and the RCMP did a great job keeping the peace. As a result, there were no Indian wars in Canada. Zero. None. The U.S. had 100,000 deaths, and we had no deaths. And I know someone will quibble and say, well, there was the Métis uprising and there were a few deaths there, but we had no Indian wars. We didn't have 100,000, we didn't have 50,000, we didn't have 10,000 dead. It should also be noted that Macdonald was close friends with two prominent Native Canadians of his time. And I won't get the names right, but I'll do my best. First was Orin Hitaka, also known as Peter Martin, and I'll stick with Peter Martin, who attended the Mohawk Institute Residential School, obtained a medical degree from the University of Toronto in 1866, and then attended Oxford University. Peter Martin later named one of his children after Macdonald and became the president of one of the largest fraternal benefit societies in the world. Fraternal benefit societies were somewhat akin to an insurance company, were very popular in those days, and people took out a membership. They had to have a common interest. Usually it was by ethnicity or something, like the Scottish Benefit Society or the English Benefit Society. But the whole idea was for ordinary people to be able to acquire something resembling insurance. So Peter Martin was the president of one of the largest of those organizations in the world, quite an achievement. He also campaigned on behalf of Macdonald in the 1872 general election. The second Indigenous friend of Macdonald's was Cataraqui, also known as Peter E. Jones, the head chief of the Mississauga of the New Credit. He received his medical degree from Queen's in 1866. He acted as a political organizer for Macdonald and consulted with him on changes to the Electoral Franchise Act of 1885, which gave some Indigenous people the right to vote. It's hard to conceive of such friendships existing and such political support existing if Macdonald harbored the ill will towards Indigenous people that his critics claim today. In closing, I suggest that an objective assessment of Macdonald's political record shows that far from engaging in genocide, his policies likely saved more Indigenous lives than the policies of any other Prime Minister in Canada. Thank you.
Greg, thank you for providing a talk that really, I think, comes close to the angst that we have felt in Kingston over the last 10, 12 years about Macdonald's place, not only in our community, but in the nation. I think many of us are aware of the term when we go to our doctor now, or certainly our lawyer, of the term evidence-driven cases. You are a vet. Evaluated on the basis of the evidence you present. And Greg, I think you've done a wonderful job today of helping to diffuse some of the angst that we have felt. I would say, reckless use of words such as genocide, very serious terms. And I think you direct us in the direction of engaging these issues in a new light, but one that doesn't jeopardize the old verities of what Macdonald did. So thank you for going to the archives, thank you for taking pen in hand, and thank you for speaking about this great Canadian. Thank you.
Maintenant, des invités déposeront des couronnes à la mémoire de Sir John A. We now come to the wreath-laying part of the ceremony. Once the wreaths have been laid, if you are able, please stand while Eric Gray pipes the lament, after which we will observe a moment of silence. This will then be followed by the singing of our national anthem. J'invite maintenant Leanna Shaw à déposer une couronne à la mémoire de Sir John A. au nom de la Société historique de Kingston. I invite Leanna Shaw to lay a wreath in Sir John A.'s memory on behalf of the Kingston Historical Society. I now invite John Selkirk to lay a wreath on behalf of the Kingston Conservative Association. Finalement, j'invite Councillor Jeff McLaren à déposer une couronne au nom de la ville de Kingston. I now invite Councillor Jeff McLaren to lay a wreath on behalf of the city of Kingston.
That's a tough job.
Would the Kingston Trio please assemble for the singing of our national anthem?
O Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love, in all our songs command. With glowing hearts we see rise the true north, strong and free. From far and wide, O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. God keep our land glorious and free. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee.
On behalf of the Kingston Historical Society, I take this opportunity to recognize the outstanding contribution of all those who made this day possible. Craig Bowles and the Cataraqui Cemetery, the Venerable William Clark, the Kingston Trio, our wreath layers, Leanna Shaw, John Selkirk, and Councillor McLaren. Our guest speaker, Greg Piasetzki, Eric Gray, Craig Pettis, and the organizers, Peter Gower, Peter Ginn, and Duncan McDowell. Ceci termine notre cérémonie commémorative. This concludes our ceremony of remembrance. The Kingston Historical Society hopes that you'll be able to join us next year. La Société Historique de Kingston vous invite à notre cérémonie l'année prochaine. So please, mark Sunday, June 6, 2027 on your calendar. Merci d'avoir assisté aujourd'hui. Thank you for joining us today.